Hungry Trilobyte podcast would like to start by acknowledging these fine conventions. SoonerCon, Oklahoma's longest-running pop culture convention, is ready to return in 2023. SoonerCon 31 will be held in Norman, Oklahoma on June 30th through July 2nd, 2023. Gaming, cosplay, autographs, and an art auction await. Visit SoonerCon.com for more details. The Hellmouth Convention, where fandoms bleed together. Evoking the center of the mystical convergence, our event includes fandoms and travelers from all over the world. Like the Hellmouth itself, things gravitate toward it that you might not find elsewhere. The celebration is scheduled for June 9th through 11th, 2023 in Los Angeles, California. Go to thehellmouth.org to plan your visit. On tap today, we have James Greene Jr. How you doing this evening, good sir?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. You are the author of a recently released book called A Convenient Parallel Dimension, where you are tracking the creation of the movie Ghostbusters.
Yeah, the whole franchise.
And I love this for a lot of reasons. Number one, I'm a huge Ghostbusters fan. But number two, you and I are like the kind of people who find the creation of something to be as interesting as the story itself. And I dig that. I haven't been able to finish your book, but so far I can't put it down. I'm just
Wow,
soaking up every detail, and I
thank you.
love your method.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, a lot of times in life, in art, the creation is can be more interesting than the finished product. And certainly with the Ghostbusters, I felt like there hadn't been a book to tell the entire story of these the first two movies and then that long wait for anything else, and then all the ups and downs, and also to put it, I tried to tell the story of the people and like kind of give some cultural context, like industry context, because I felt like no one had done that either.
That is a huge win for me because we're not seeing that culture and that the industry environment that you had in the late 70s, early 80s today. People who are in the industry now don't really know what that was like. I mean, I'm not saying I do personally because I'm only 41, so I was born right around the time the movie was being made. But there's such a different world now that movies don't get dreamed of the same way, much less made the same way. And I think that your book does a good job at fleshing that out.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's crazy to even like just in doing research about this and going back and reading news articles from the early 80s, or talk, when I interviewed Frank Price, who is the head of Columbia Pictures, set the Ghostbusters deal in motion, and it was the fact that, like, when Bill Murray was trying to break into movies, there was this feeling like, what's happening? Like the whole industry is crumbling. That they're putting Bill Murray in movies now, and like, it's so alien to like the idea of like, I came up in a time, or like, his personality notwithstanding, it's like he's the funniest guy, and any movie of his, you're gonna find something really funny, and then he's guaranteed to sell tickets, like, just always a superstar. But there was a time where they're like, who, what is it? It's interesting because it makes me think of that episode of Freaks and Geeks where the bullies are picking on the kids, and they're like, Bill Murray isn't funny. And I remember seeing that, years ago, and thinking like, there's no way anybody ever really felt that way. It's there. And it's like, yeah, it's absolutely.
Well, we're going through this book here, and like Eddie Murphy is another name that comes up. And unfortunately, the joke is now that Eddie Murphy just isn't funny.
Yeah.
And we've seen what he's done in the last his projects he's picked, but there was a time Eddie Murphy was considered to be the funniest man on the planet.
Oh yeah, like single-handedly saved Saturday Night Live from cancellation. Everybody wanted him in their project, and yeah, and uh, yeah, that's another strange part of life of I guess being I'm 43, of also like I remember a time where it was like everyone was obsessed with Eddie Murphy. Then it seemed like suddenly everyone just turned on him, and it's like he's not well, but what's interesting though too is like I remember I worked at a video store in college in the mid 90s, at a time when the Eddie Murphy jokes really started, like, oh, this guy, he's not funny anymore. But when working in that video store, we couldn't keep any of his movies, like any of his recent films. I think Dr. Doolittle it was Dr. Doolittle, or oh gosh, I wanted Holy Man or something like that. Like, we could not keep them on the shelves. He was still super popular.
Mhm.
There was just this perception, it became he was a punching bag. It was like, because he had some flops.
He had some flops, and I mean, because he had been an actor, a successful actor for so long at that point, he just wanted to branch away from being the funny guy. He wanted to do other things to keep his own wit sharp, and I don't begrudge him that at all.
Mhm. Yeah, 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 certainly. And how long, you can't stay 22 years old forever. So
No.
he's not, and that was sort of like, it was interesting. I guess he tried to mature the character of Axel Foley in Beverly Hills Cop 3. But it's like, uh, it's hard to compete against your own track record, or people's memories, or people's expectations, no matter how great you are, how successful you are at transitioning, or figuring out what else to do.
Something else that's kind of happened in film culture over the past 15 to 20 years is we've got away from this idea of a single actor opening a movie. That there was a time that if you had a key actor in the movie, people would know nothing about it and go to see that actor. You saw this with Murphy, you saw it with Stallone and
Mhm.
Schwarzenegger and Bruce Willis, and
Yeah.
to a lesser extent like Jackie Chan.
Mhm.
But you don't really have those personalities now the way you did back in the 80s and 90s.
No, no, it's much more about IP, and like,
Mhm.
you know, the franchise is like, there's so many franchises, and yeah, you're absolutely right. The last person I can kind of remember, that I remember, just like, anecdotally or colloquially, people being like, "Oh, I'll go see that Ryan Reynolds movie because I know Ryan Reynolds is funny and good looking."
Mhm.
This is going back like 10 years, and
Sure.
obviously he's still very popular, but that's the last instance I can think of. Whereas now it's more like, oh, they're launching this film franchise, or they're doing this with Marvel, or this is the new comic thing, or like they're bringing this back, or they're bringing that back. Uh, so yeah. Um, it's crazy.
I,
Go ahead.
I not to belabor the point. I kind of feel like I felt that way with the bulk of Vin Diesel's work. Like he was the attempt to open a movie with an actor at a point where that didn't really work anymore.
Yeah, and then he but he still had the Fast and the Furious.
Mhm.
The which those critic That's like the critic proof franchise.
Yeah.
People are going to go see it whether it's good or bad. Um, yeah, and you're right. Yeah, Vin Diesel, but
But like you were saying, at that point, it becomes more about the IP than about him. It was like a transitional franchise in that
yeah,
sense, at least.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So everybody's bigger, and then you see, like, Marvel has become like the only way a lot of these people can still work, or like, it's, Robert Redford is in some of these Marvel movies, and to me, it's like, man, like, what? So why are you doing that, Robert Redford? Like, do you need the money, or is it like you want something to do, or like, but and recently they're like, oh, Bill Murray is going to be in Ant-Man 3, which seems like that's ridiculous. Why would he do that? But that's what's left.
I could see it for Bill Murray because Bill Murray strikes me as the kind of guy who will do anything to amuse himself. Because he doesn't need the money, he doesn't need the
Mhm.
work, but if it strikes him as being a fun way to spend an afternoon, he would do it.
Yeah, I
Robert
mean,
Redford, no.
Bill Murray might need the money because he has like 6 kids and God knows how many grandkids, and he's been divorced twice. So it's entirely possible he needs the money. Probably not, not need in the same way like you and I might need money. But I think an interesting thing that the pandemic has taught us is that finances are tenuous for everybody. I remember seeing an interview with David Crosby, and you think of him like, oh, David Crosby has been famous for so long, but he's like, if I don't tour, I'm going to lose my house. You know, so it's I think, as rich as these people are, they still have, they're not as rich, I guess, as we think. So I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, to me, it's like, I don't know, but of course, the bigger conversation now is like,
Mhm.
how much, how have we tolerated Bill Murray's bad behavior for so many decades? Like, why are they giving him work?
Fair enough. Fair enough. I but to go back to your book for a minute, I mean, most people who haven't spent years researching the topic the way you have, well, if they know a lot about Ghostbusters, it is from sharing factoids with other fans or listening to the commentary tracks on the DVD. What's the biggest piece that they might be missing if they've taken that path?
Well, I think I think there's a lot of stuff to miss because I think like uh, I think there were things there was a lot of stuff Ivan Reitman and Dan Aykroyd and all those people didn't really, just kind of glossed over, didn't get into, or I feel like there was no they were they had like a lot of people, like a lot of celebrities, like a lot of famous people, a lot of actors or actresses or directors. They have like, this is the narrative I want to tell, and I'm not comfortable like saying any more or delving into other areas. And to me, it's like you kind of missed that, like, a lot of critics hated the first Ghostbusters when it came out. That's like, yeah, and Columbia thought it was going to be a bomb. They didn't think it was going to do well. And I think, there's kind of cultural like framing like that, and just the reluctance of some of these people talking about the more negative aspects of the harder stuff. And certainly, there's been a lot of complaints in the Ghostbusters fandom about how they have not given the same attention to Ghostbusters 2 as the first movie in terms of like home video releases with lots of extras and stuff. And it's my understanding that they don't like to revisit Ghostbusters 2 because it didn't do that well. It was still $100 million movie, but it didn't. They wanted it to be like a $300 million movie. They thought it was going to save everything. And that hurts, and they don't want to. They don't want to necessarily. And it was difficult to make, I think, in a lot of respects. And they took a lot of critical hits for it too. So, I think, but I also, just in general, I think what's fascinating to me, or what I've learned working on this book, and just being a freelance writer slash researcher in general, is just how much information is not on the internet about anything. There's so much that's only, like newspapers and magazines, our history that's been cataloged in library databases, that the internet is really just scratching the surface. So this is my appeal for everyone to go get a library card to your local library, because you can't even comprehend how much information about our history, about everything is just not available.
I completely agree and seconded on that. And that's why I like the way you took the approach you did, because you're grabbing this information at the time. I've seen so many cases where reviews of it, let's just take movies for this example, because that's what we're talking about right now, that there's so much revisionist viewing of the way a movie was made, Ghostbusters 2 being a great example, that people will really kind of sit on it and act like it's not that great of a movie, or and while you might not like it as much as the first, I consider it to be a very, very great movie, honestly. And most people I knew at the time felt that way, that I knew
Yeah,
of.
I mean, I think it's a lot of fun.
Mhm.
It's got some funny parts, and it's yeah, it's not the worst movie ever made or anything. I think that it's just sort of like, um, it has a different feeling, and it's sort of like, maybe it just doesn't have the same magic as the first one. And that's, of course, what sequel does. I mean, it's so rare
Mhm.
that a sequel can match that or duplicate it. And yeah, it was, like I said, even though it's viewed as like a disappointment or it didn't work, it was still $100 million movie. It made them lots of money. I don't know that they necessarily, some dispute as to whether or not it actually turned a profit. But yeah, it's a huge part of part of culture. Everyone is familiar with the pink slime, Vigo the Carpathian. I mean, this is stuff it's still in our consciousness, and like we're still given the ghosts, given the peace sign, the logo from the second movie. Yeah, certainly. but it's also I think that people, I think because a lot of us were kids when it came out, where I remember I couldn't believe like they were making a Ghostbusters 2. I felt like I had won the lottery. Like,
Mhm.
this is amazing. They're making a second Ghostbusters. And a lot of us had that excitement about it. And it was, when you're a kid, you don't know, like, I knew that it wasn't like they maybe had a lot of difficulty with it before I started working on the book. I understood maybe it wasn't the easiest thing in the world for them to do, but it wasn't until like I spoke to like Kim Masters, who visited the set for Premiere Magazine, where she was like, yeah, it wasn't a happy set. Like, there was a bad vibe. And I talked to a few other people who were like, yeah, it was tough, it was tricky, it was, we didn't have time, it was as crunched, if not a little bit more crunched than the first movie. And you're dealing with those like expectations of like, it's the second Ghostbusters, we have to, how do we outdo ourselves, can we outdo ourselves? And I think they've all felt pressure in general. I'm sure people asked Harold Ramis and Dan Aykroyd about it every day of their lives until I made it. So um, yeah, I'm kind of rambling at this point. So
No, no, I get it. And because when you make a sequel of any movie, you lose the what you had the first time is that you can when you give the people the first movie, they don't know what they're getting. They kind of just have this first experience and the newness and freshness of it all. Sometimes it's enough to carry you. And Ghostbusters was so new and so fresh that it was a charming experience. And it's very hard to give somebody the same thing but better. Like you said, it happens so rarely.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that also, I mean, it's kind of the Ghostbusters is the pinnacle of like that stretch in all their careers, where everything just kind of it's still like I would describe Ivan Reitman's style, like comedically, his filmmaking, a little ramshackle, a little like, I don't know, I don't know if I can articulate it, but it's a little, his movies usually look more like comedies. It's more apparent, that you're watching something funny. Where Ghostbusters, the 1984 original, just kind of treads the line, or kind of blends. There's such a blending of like comedy, but also like a visceral, real look. Like they purposely shot it to look more like a documentary, or like grittier, you know and it mixes so many different kinds of humor. I think Roger Ebert's the one who pointed this out, the first time I considered it, that they're mixing like sarcasm and parody and American idioms, and just like weird off the wall humor, but also like classic kind of American humor, whereas they couldn't get that all together for Ghostbusters 2. It was
Mhm.
just it's just the way it is.
Yeah, when I and this didn't start with your book, but you've done a really good job of fleshing it out in my brain. I go through the history of the original Ghostbusters and all the revisions and the changes of concepts and the new ideas they had. And each time I hear one, I sit back and I think, I want to see this movie too. I mean, I like the movie that I got, but I would really like to see this other version that kicked around maybe over one cup of coffee and then decided it wasn't the way to go. There's so
Yeah.
many different ways they could have gone that I all love them all.
Yeah, exactly. Like, when the headquarters was in like across the river in New Jersey, and they blow up half of New Jersey, or like, yeah, I would love to see, Richard Pryor, with the Ghostbusters, or or John Belushi, or what if they are going to different dimensions? It's like all that stuff is super fun to imagine, especially when you also have the reference point of like, oh, this is maybe what it would have looked like, with the first movie. Um, yeah, that's like, it's interesting because, yeah, when I interviewed people who worked on it, and I asked them like, uh, could you tell by reading the script like, that this was going to be something special? And some of them were like, yeah, you could kind of feel that this was a little different, or this is going to be something unique. And some people were like, no, it was just words on a page. Like, I had no idea. Like, like who can, like, you can never tell. Um, Yeah, as the audience, we're fortunate enough, or maybe unfortunate, I don't know, we can only work backwards, you know?
Mhm.
So
You look through when you're building the historical context, you list all the movies that are kind of the peers of this as it's getting made and the other movies that are going on at this time. And I love that because you get this point where you say to yourself, oh, well, this is a timeless classic. Oh, this is a timeless classic. I think I might have heard of that. And I've never heard of this movie before in my life. And you start to realize that it's kind of the same thing. You don't know which ones are going to rise to the top until well after the fact. At the time, most people wouldn't have been able to pick the winners from the losers.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's yeah, and it was just fascinating to go back and read through what people were comparing it to, or what like this is, this is the only thing they can compare it to, what molds are they looking toward. And I was surprised, I think it was in the review that ran in Variety, where they're like, oh, this is just like a comedy version of The Sentinel, which is the 70s horror movie, I think with Chris Sarandon, where it's
Mhm.
like it's a building in New York that's been haunted. And that movie is very disturbing in some parts. To me it's like, oh my god, that movie is like really freaky. And so it's like, and again, this is also like you're getting into everyone's different point of view, where it's like, um but there are some things that are like totally true, that you can't, like when they say, oh, the audiences that watched American Werewolf in London were really confused, like they didn't know whether to laugh or scream. And I was like, oh yeah, of course, because that movie has some parts that are really funny, and then like it gets so hyper violent, just like unnecessarily hyper violent. You're like, oh yeah, this is kind of is all over the place. But again, it's, compared to The Howling, which, The Howling is a little bit sillier, but still like, oh, there are parts of that where it's like, this is maybe a little too much. But yeah, it's fascinating to see all the whole tapestry of what was happening back then.
And another thing that we've kind of lost in this day and age was that we would look at a year of movies, and when this would be one movie released among many, all of which had very different concepts, appealing to very different audiences. But it just seemed exciting to see this buffet of movies that you could choose from that year, and that that lasted well through the Ghostbusters 2 era. And by the time we got around to the 2016 Ghostbusters movies, that was well in the rear view mirror. We didn't really do that anymore. By that point, it was at the IP era.
Yeah, and you're also starting to get into you know streaming and like Netflix and stuff, that's kind of staving off a lot of like, like I think I talk about this a little bit, towards the end of the book, where it's like, the kind of movies that Jason Reitman, built his early career on, are the kinds of movies now that don't go to theaters at all. They wind up on a streaming service. Um, and some people are kind of like, well, that's, his movies weren't doing well anymore, so he went and said, all right, I'll do a Ghostbusters. Um, but it's but it's also, you can't just say these movies aren't doing it. It's just also like the cultural appetite is changing. Like what people want is like, you know, uh, people would rather like people are more. There's a greater, interest in like spectacle, or like, can the Marvel experiment be replicated? And people don't necessarily want to spend their money going to a theater is expensive. We're assuming that, when there aren't, like three or four different plagues going on, if you
Mhm,
could go to
mhm.
the theater safely, it's expensive, and they don't necessarily want to go just sit and watch like a dramedy. Or I'm blanking on the names of a lot of his movies right now, Jason Reitman. But you know but I think, yeah, it's totally changed. Like you're not going to get a movie like Thank You for Smoking, or or Up in the Air. Like I just it's not going to go into a theater now.
Yeah, and that's something I really feel like I don't want to say we have to get back to it, but I feel like that people who look at Ghostbusters and think, man, this was a crowning achievement in filmmaking. And I'm one of those people for sure, that you have to realize that there are paths to find the same kind of experiences today. They're just not in the movie theater anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, you also have to just be open to new experiences and like what what can what might have the ability to touch you in a way that you weren't expecting. Um, you know, like one of the movies that I watched while I was working on this book was a Yugoslavian movie called "As Young and Healthy as a Rose," which has a brief appearance from Slavica Jovan, who played Gozer. This is like 10 years before she played Gozer,
Mhm.
and it's like this is a this like it's kind of a silly like crime drug like sex movie, but the context is like this is revolutionary to put on the screen in Yugoslavia in the mid 70s, and
Mhm.
it's like you like suddenly it's like if you understand it, like you feel like you understand the swagger and like what this means and how this is like really trying to stand up for people's rights, for youth rights and stuff like that, and you kind of like, oh yeah, I get it, like that, that I can see that, and I think that this ties into another part. Like people need to be more open to experiencing foreign films and foreign culture, and you never like another like I don't know if you got to this part in the book where after Ghostbusters, Bill Murray moved to France and spent time in France getting away from his fame, but also studying acting. And he was like, "Oh, I saw the best movie of my life that I ever saw. It was uh, it's a it was a film that they only had one copy of, only one print of it, and it was the Russian print, so we couldn't understand any of it. I want to say it was Happy something, Happy Valley. I don't remember the name. Oh, I feel so dumb. But he's like, this movie changed my life. I didn't understand what anyone was saying, but I was still touched by it. It was this incredible experience, and I just felt like, how could anybody not look like? How can anyone think about any other movie after you've seen this? And it's like if he hadn't had that experience where he went to France and was going to theaters there, he may have never seen that movie. And I think it's important to to open yourself. It's going to drive me nuts that I can't remember the name of that movie.
I hate
Uh,
that.
and I don't have a copy of the book sitting next to me, so all right, I'll just let it go. But
Okay. If it comes to you, I will put it in the show notes just so we can make sure that it gets established. So don't worry about that.
okay, okay, thank you.
But yeah, that's actually happened on a previous episode. There's a movie I keep raving about. I saw it several years ago. It was a vampire movie, and every time it comes up, I can't actually remember the name of it, and it always drives me crazy. I totally get where you're coming from there.
Hmm. Wow,
Um,
let it go.
but I will completely agree with you there in that I think foreign film is one of the last areas most film fans go to get a new experience. And it should be one of the first areas people go to get a new experience, because people
Hmm.
will say, I'm a horror fan. And I pick on horror fans because they're some of my best friends. So I don't mind giving them a good old ripping here and there.
Hmm.
But they'll be like, I'm a horror fan. And, what am I going to do when I run out of horror movies to watch? I'm going to try out fantasy, but I don't really like it. Or I'm going to try out hard sci-fi and I don't really like it. Well, why don't you try out more horror, but from Germany or
Hmm.
France or Japan or Russia?
Yeah.
You'll probably get the same vibe you're looking for, maybe better,
Hmm.
because you stuck with what you like, but you found it from a different point of view.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yep.
And the people talk about, subtitle. Do we even do dubbing anymore? Is that a thing?
Yeah, it is because both of my kids like to watch anime, and
Okay.
they have to make a decision sometimes whether they want to see it. Sometimes they're in the mood for it to be dubbed, and so other times they want to look at the subtitles because I think that they cut the shows or they edit the shows differently for each instance. Um, so yeah, they definitely they're still dubbing going on. So
Okay.
um,
'Cause I've been on the subtitle train for as long as I can remember. I make sometimes I make the exception for anime for the exact reason you just mentioned, but for any other genre, I just consider it to be
subtitle the default on that. And I know that was dubbing was a big thing in like up until the late 80s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's just one of those things that I really think, especially with now we have the million streaming services and YouTube is right under your feet. And even things like the Internet Archive will just put foreign language films up that you can watch for free. There's no reason not to dip your toe into it.
That's right. And also, I just looked it up. The name of that movie that Bill Murray saw that was only in Russian is called A Romance of Happy Valley, and it was originally made in 1919.
Okay.
And that's still the only copy that you can find. I believe it's in France, and it was rescued. It was borrowed, taken from, stolen from the Russian National Archives. I don't remember the exact story, but there you go.
Okay. Well, now is it? He said he didn't understand any of it. Was it silent? In 1919, I'm thinking maybe.
Well, if it was silent, it only had like the Russian cards. You know,
Right.
it didn't have the English translation.
That's what I was getting. I say,
Yeah,
I know it's a step farther for a lot of people, but I mean, once you dabble in foreign film, and you really have to look into silence next,
yeah,
because
yeah.
when you look at filmmaking as a visual storytelling, please pardon me for getting on a soapbox here, I'm sorry, but it's like it's visual storytelling, and then you're completely taking out most of the spoken words at all, and you're sticking purely on the visuals. Silence are amazing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of
Okay.
incredible silent films, and it's like a
That's,
whole different language practically.
it really is. It's a whole different sensibility in terms of how things are made, and again, sorry, I just get jazzed about that sort of thing. But we're
No,
both film fans, and we both dig this. So,
absolutely.
what are your memories of being invested in the film franchise, the Ghostbusters franchise, as a kid?
Well, it was like it seemed like the most exciting thing. Yeah, it's hard to sort of, this was the hardest part, I think, about the book to write. It was the introduction. I didn't want to go on too long about my the way it made me feel as a kid, because it was difficult to put into words, as you can see. um it was like this crazy, it seemed like I was attracted to it because it seemed to have like all this adult humor that I didn't necessarily understand, but also was like amusing to me. It was like an incredible concept, of like guys fighting ghosts, and the special effects were awesome. And I grew up, like an hour or so outside of New York City, so it felt like this is like relatable, like my own memories. I had memories that look like, a lot of the scenes in the original Ghost, like a lot of the background scenes and the scenes of the city and stuff. So it felt tangible, but at the same time, it was like, this is so fantastical, and these guys are so funny and weird. um and then, when they made Ghostbusters 2, like I said, I was like ecstatic, like I couldn't believe it. And I was so mad in the summer of 1989. I lived in a town with only one movie theater. I don't even think they showed Ghostbusters 2 there. I think they were showing Ghostbusters 2 in the next town over.
Mhm.
But for whatever reason, I didn't get to go see it in the theater. I didn't get to see Batman either. I was excited about Batman too, but but it was like, when I finally saw it on video, I was like, this is great, it's wonderful, I love it, da da da. And then, like everybody else, I spent decades like like, when are they ever gonna make Ghostbusters 3? Like, what's going on with that? And it was, followed it as obsessively as anybody else, I think. And yeah, just I wanted, and I got to, after when they announced Afterlife, I was like, all right, I got to seriously try to do this book now, because I tried to do it in the past and it didn't take off, but I was like, I gotta make this happen.
Well, I'm darn glad you did, because this is a story that needs to be told. I'm glad somebody with your perspective is telling it, rather than somebody who's going to just completely gloss over the warts, and like you say at the beginning of the book, you're all about the warts, because that's really where the flavor of the history gets lost, and not just looking at the mistakes and the stupid decisions and the dumb arguments that resulted in the result that we have now. The thing that we love, might have come from some really bad decisions or just some weirdness, and that's okay. Just be honest about what happened and how we got here.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's obviously, you're I think it's tricky because you're dealing with somebody as volatile as Bill Murray, who's also, the anchor of a lot of it. Um and it seemed to me like I heard all sorts of different things about Ivan Reitman when I was working on this book. I think there were things he just didn't. He's like, I don't want to get into it. I don't feel like talking about it. He's kind of like, I don't know, just not just not as open as other people. And I think Dan Aykroyd too is also a little more like, Dan Aykroyd's always struck me as like an old school Hollywood type of person who's like, I'm selling the picture. I don't want to talk about the negative stuff. So and Ernie Hudson is obviously a class act, and he's
Mhm.
not gonna throw anybody under the bus. I mean, he's definitely discussed some of the more difficult issues he's had working on the Ghostbusters movies, but he's also expressed plenty of gratitude for it, and he's not bitter, or he doesn't seem to be bitter, you know. And I don't know. And I mean, I guess it boils down to like it's so successful, and it's like maybe they feel like Ghostbusters makes so many people happy. You know, why would we want to dig up the negative stuff? I don't know.
I completely respect that. And I also respect the fact that, these people were in their 20s and 30s when they got this project off the ground. And, decades later, they're just very different people, professionally, artistically, personally, spiritually. I get that you grow as a person, and just airing out your dirty laundry that far after the fact doesn't seem to benefit anybody. If that's if you're trying to keep it buried for that reason, I get it.
Yeah,
But it's,
but I feel also like if you, oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead, go ahead. I'll wait.
Uh, but at the same time, where it's like something, if you create something that's so popular as Ghostbusters, where people feel ownership of it and people have such a stake in it, it's also like, well, why wouldn't you want obviously, the issues between Bill Murray and Harold Ramis were, they were bigger than Ghostbusters, or like, yeah, I think that, it's to me, it's sort of like, listen, I understand why Steven Spielberg might not want to talk about the Twilight Zone movie, you know, but you know, no one committed like manslaughter on a Ghostbusters movie. So I kind of feel like everything was resolved. They made Ghostbusters Afterlife. Like, why not get into it? You obviously all remain friends to some extent.
And what I was going to get at was, even though we just talked about the number of ways that the world is different today, the industry is different today, the culture is different today, there are people out there who would like to make the next Ghostbusters, or their own movie that would be a Ghostbusters-ish experience, and they're probably having a hell of a time. They're probably dealing with a lot of their own warts that they they shouldn't be discouraged because of that, because it does come out in the wash, and really great things have come from some really trying circumstances.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And we won't even know what the next thing. I think it's impossible to know what the next thing is, or like the only reason I have any any grasp on like what's new and exciting is because I have two teenage kids. I mean, I wouldn't know, I wouldn't know otherwise. But it's this is another huge thing is like you have to factor in like movie watching attention is divided also between video games and the internet now in such a way, like video games have become so insane. Like
Hmm.
and that's like my kids, their main thing is like, oh man, like they're so invested in the lore of like their favorite gaming experiences. So it's like you got all that going on. So whoever's making the next Ghostbusters, the next movie of that ilk, is like also going to be like, the next Ghostbusters may have already come out as a video game, in terms of effect and popularity, So
Well, I mean, for the longest time, the Ghostbusters, Xbox 360 era game basically was Ghostbusters 3. It was treated as such for quite a while.
yeah, yeah,
And because we just lost hope that the Ghostbusters 3 was ever going to get made. So we just took what we had.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But I meant like, like there's probably a new property, that's having the effect in that realm that
Right. And I got what you meant. I just felt like that was just an interesting that we had to use Ghostbusters as that specific example when that we literally did have a phase in the fandom where it's like, this is all you're ever going to get. Deal with it.
yeah, yeah. And I interviewed the guy who like spearheaded that Ghostbusters video game, and they were gonna call it Ghostbusters 3, like right up until, I think, like right up until it was almost done, because they didn't excuse me. The way he tells it is that Sony did not have any attachment to the property. They kind of didn't care about it. But once the ball started rolling with this Ghostbusters video game, they kind of saw the reaction that it was getting. They're like, oh, maybe there's hope for a third movie. So let's just call this Ghostbusters the video game. Like, for the majority of its development, it was called Ghostbusters 3.
I had an early DVD, and I'm trying to remember. It might have been one of the Ghostbusters, but for some reason, I don't think it was. I think it was another Dan Aykroyd movie. But when it listed his filmography, it actually listed Ghostbusters 3 as coming out in 2003 because they were just so certain it was going to happen.
There was a, on the 1941 DVD, it lists Ghostbusters 3 coming out in 1999, and I think there's a similar credit on one of the Blues Brothers DVDs, because they were they were convinced it was going to happen. Yeah, I recently like tweeted about that. I tweeted like a screenshot of the 1941 filmography for Dan Aykroyd, and yeah,
Well, James, I want to thank you so much for writing this book. And I want to thank you so much for being here on the show with me today. I would love to have you back anytime.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to come back anytime.
I'm going to link your book in the show notes so people can pick it up in whatever format they choose. I'm going to put your Twitter information on there and your website. Is there anywhere else people can go to follow your adventures on the internet?
my adventures on the internet and in life. Yeah, I've got a blog that's at I'm gonna spell the letters. It's jgtwo.com, jg2.com. That was my nickname for a really long time. Yeah, I've been posting more on there, as of late, because it looks like Twitter is about to explode. But yeah, that's basically it, yeah. So, and whatever, yeah, Twitter or wherever.
I'll make sure that all goes in the show notes. James, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was great. Thanks.